Hello and welcome to Camp, the Catholic Audiobook in a Month podcast. My name is William Wilson, and today is day 23 of The Practice of the Presence of God by Brother Lawrence. I will be reading the second part of his life, or eulogy. In it you will see Brother Lawrence going through a classic dark night of the soul. We get more details about the first 10 years of his religious life that Brother Lawrence spoke about previously. You will see that he had no true taste in prayer. There was no mitigation in his sorrow. He spent whole nights at the foot of the holy altar. And here's key, faith alone is his only support, which reminds me of midnight for St. John of the Cross. He then reaches a point of total abandonment. I'm no further concerned about what I do, or what I suffer, if I but continue affectionately united to his will, this being my whole business. And for more on abandonment, check out camp.fm/abandonment. Then, all of a sudden, God opened his servant's eyes. Let's get started. Brother Lawrence gave himself particularly to the study of prayer, and whatever throng of other business he had, it never made him lose the time appointed for this holy exercise. The presence of God and charity, which is the effect of it, were his most beloved virtues. These made him, in a little time, an example to his fellow probationers, and the victorious grace of Jesus Christ made him embrace with ardor all penitential exercises, and even seek after such austerities as nature had the great abhorrence of. And though the superiors had allotted Lawrence the meanest and most despicable office in the monastery, yet he never dropped the least complaint. On the contrary, grace, which is never discouraged by what's harsh and uneasy, supported him in the tedious and disagreeable charge that was assigned him, and whatever reluctancy he found from the side of nature, he accepted all with pleasure, reckoning himself too happy either to suffer or to be humbled, after the example of his Saviour. The notion they had of his merit, and the esteem he had acquired by the heroic acts of his virtue, obliged the master of the novices that he might make a trial of his vocation and the solidity of his judgment, to enlarge on some difficult cases to him, to crowd him with different pieces of work, and to task him as a well-advanced Christian. He was so far from being discouraged on account of this trial that he stood it out with all the fidelity that could be expected. This further appeared on another occasion, for when one of the fraternity came and told him they were speaking of turning him out of the monastery, his answer was, "I am in the hands of God. He'll do with me what he pleases. I do not act from any worldly motive. If I am no more to be a servant here, elsewhere I shall serve." When the time of his profession came, he made no delay to sacrifice himself wholly and unreservedly to God. I could relate here a great many of his excellent actions, which would convince the reader of the fullness of his sacrifice, and might capture the reader's attention, but I passed them over in silence, that I may enlarge the longer on the internal troubles that afflicted his soul, partly by an order of divine providence, which permitted it to be so, for the purification of his soul, and partly for want of experience, since he would take his own way in the spiritual life. He considered the sins of his past life, and the sight of them struck him with such a horror, and rendered him so little and contemptible in his own eyes, that he thought himself altogether unworthy of the least caresses of the bridegroom. He found, however, that he had very much of his favor, and entertaining such humble sense of his own misery, he could not venture to accept of the heavenly treasures that God offered him, not yet knowing that God was so merciful as to communicate himself to such a sinner as he believed himself to be. It was then that the fear of illusion began very powerfully to seize him, and his state appeared so doubtful that he knew not what it would turn to. This afterwards occasioned in him such terrible torments that he could express them no otherwise than by comparing them to those of hell itself. In this miserable condition, he went very often into a closet near the cook-room, where he had a crucifix fastened to a pillar, and there he poured out his afflicted soul, all bathed in tears, before his God, and conjured him that he would not let him perish, because he put his whole trust in him, and had no other intention but to please him. Notwithstanding the prayers he offered up to God, his troubles increased by such embarrassing fears and perplexities that his mind was suddenly distracted. Solitude, which he had all along looked upon to be a very safe harbor, appeared then to him like a sea tossed with furious tempests. His soul was driven like a ship with winds and waves, so that he knew not what part to act, nor what to resolve. On the other hand, he felt in himself a secret inclination, which moved him to resign himself to God by a continual oblation of himself to his conduct. And on the other, the fear he had of wandering out of the common road made him offer an innocent resistance to God. These and such views, so grievous to human nature, filled him with profound horror. Moreover, his soul was plunged in so much bitterness and in such thick darkness that he received neither comfort nor assistance from heaven or earth. This way, however rigorous and severe it may be, is nevertheless what God often takes to try the virtue of his true servants before he entrusts them with the inestimable treasures of his wisdom. And this method he took with Brother Lawrence. One cannot imagine to what lengths his patience, his meekness, his moderation, his resolution, and his tranquillity carried him during these trials, for he was so humble in his own sentiments and conduct, having very small ideas of himself, that he had no real esteem for anything else but humiliations and sufferings. Accordingly, he asked no more but the cup of the Lord, and to drink up whatever was bitter in it. Nor did it yet please God to gratify him with the least of that sweetness and unction which he had felt at the beginning of his penitence. No, all was taken from him, and during the 10 years that his fears and troubles continued, he had very little ease or intermission. No true taste in prayer, no mitigation of his sorrows, which reduced him to such extreme necessities that he became burdensome and nauseous to himself. Faith alone was his only support. In the multitude of these different thoughts which reduced him to extremity, his courage never left him. On the contrary, in his most violent troubles, he always had recourse to prayer, to the exercise of the presence of God, to the practice of all Christian and religious virtues, to bodily austerities, to tears and groanings and long watchings, spending sometimes almost whole nights at the feet of the holy altar. There, at length, as he was one day reflecting on the sorrows of his afflicted soul, and knowing that it was for the love of God and for fear of displeasing him that he suffered them, he immediately entered upon a generous resolution to bear those troubles, not only for the rest of his life, but even throughout all eternity, if it should please God so to order it. For, said he, I'm no further concerned about what I do or what I suffer, if I but continue affectionately united to his will, this being my whole business. Here was now precisely the disposition God wanted him to be in, to heap on him his favors, and so from this moment the constancy and resolution of his mind increased more than ever. And God, who lies under no necessity of times or much reasonings to make himself known to us, all of a sudden opened his servant's eyes. Lawrence felt in himself a ray of divine light, which, penetrating his mind, dissipated all his fears, eased and removed his pains, and the favors he then received more than recompensed his past afflictions. It was now that he came to know firsthand the truth of St. Gregory the Great's words that the world appears very little to a soul that contemplates the greatness of God. The letters he wrote to a religious lady of the Carmelites put this beyond all doubt. Here, in a few words, is what they contain. The whole world seems incapable of pleasing me. Everything I see with my bodily eyes passes before me like phantoms and dreams. What I see with the eyes of my soul is the only thing I desire, and if it but happens to be out of my sight, it is the subject of my sorrow and torment. While, on the other hand, I am dazzled with the brightness of this divine sun of righteousness, which dissipates the shades of the night, and on the other, confounded with the corruption of my miserable state, I am often, as it were, out of myself. My ordinary business, however, is to remain in the presence of God, with all the humility of an unprofitable, though faithful servant. This holy exercise filled up his peculiar character, and the habit he had formed of it was so very natural to him that, as he explains it afterwards in one of his letters, and elsewhere too, he spent the last 40 years of his life in the actual exercise of the presence of God, or rather, to use his own expressions, in a pious and familiar conversation with him. That's all for today. I hope you enjoyed the reading. Tomorrow I will read the third part of The Life of Nicholas Herman. If you have enjoyed today's podcast, please subscribe, rate, share, and help us grow. Also, please check out oratebooks.com, now featuring The Ways of Mental Prayer by Vital Léodet. Praised by Pope St. Pius X and spiritual leaders across generations, this masterwork guides readers through the transformative journey of prayer, from its foundational practices to its most profound mystical heights. That's oratebooks.com. If you'd like to learn more about us, please visit camp.fm. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you tomorrow.